Hi everybody. For my third day of my little monthly content every day for November challenge, I wanted to do a video instead of something in writing. And this one was sort of inspired by a question on social media because I'd asked if people had specific topics they wanted me to touch on. And this is probably the most popular question or the most common question that I get, or one of them, which is about elves and sex. Yeah, I hear that one a lot. I've also written about it already a couple times, which is part of why I thought the video might be a better option this time. So, this is a complicated topic. It doesn't seem like it would be, but it is. And I want to start by sort of rewinding a bit and looking at the older source material that we have for how we know that elves and fairies were looked at, going back to specifically in the English language, about the 14th century. I mean, we could go back even further into like the 9th century. So we'll just sort of put a blanket over that whole like 500 years, we'll say. And when we look at textual material from that period, whether it's the Leech books, whether it's popular writing, what we see is a pretty common practice of elves in particular, because this is sort of predating the use of the word fairy. Elves, elfa, being glossed or being seen as equivalent to incubi. So very early on, there was a clear connection or association, at least with the Christian writers, that elves had this very sexual nature to them, if you will, that they were immediately associated with specifically sexual demons, incubi. For those of you who don't know what an incubus is, an incubus in Christian demonology, as far as I understand it, is a specific type of demon that would come to a person while they were sleeping, seduce them in their sleep, generally have sex with them, and sometimes, if the person they were seducing was female, would then beget a child on them. And we won't get any more into that because it's a whole separate topic, but just to give you an idea of this is what elves were being equated to. So the understanding of what they were that we have in writing from that period kind of very firmly equates them to this. Now, yes, you can certainly argue that to some degree this could have been propaganda, that we could argue that the different Christian writers were equating them to these sort of sexual demons because they wanted people to have a more negative view of them. However, even in the older, more traditional folklore that we have, the writing that we have, which, in fairness, all of the writing we have, looking at particularly the Germanic and the Norse and the Celtic material, is going to have been written down by Christians one way or another. So all of it's going to have some Christian influence. There's kind of no real way to get around that. But when we look at some of the material that is older and was written down by people who were either more sympathetic to what they were writing down or seemed to have been making more of an effort to genuinely preserve the material they were writing down and not have as much of a spin on it, if you will. It's really more in the later 15th, 16th century that we start to see clear manipulation of the material to influence how people are perceiving it, in my opinion. When we go back much further, we seem to see more of a genuine effort by the writers to just preserve what was out there. So, sorry, that was a little tangent. But that all said, when we look at some of the older material, we still see these sexual overtones. When we look at the Alfar in the Norse, there has always been this sort of understanding, first of all, that they were all male. There were no female elves in the Norse, in the original. That is a much, much later belief that comes in, I believe, specifically from the Swedish. It had to do with a difficulty translating a particular grammatical aspect of it. Either way, also, don't want to get off on a tangent about that, but they were all originally male. And we do see them having children with humans. We see that in some of the Norse sagas where particular heroes, or in one case, the sister of a king, is noted to have been half-elven, to have had an elven father. And that's usually significant to the story in some way, or the person is significant because of that ancestry. So in those cases, it's not really super emphasized, the sexual aspect, but we do know that it was a factor, and that it was just sort of taken as sort of a norm, I guess you could say. And we do also see it in the Irish. If you go back to some of the older mythology, the idea that humans could have lovers among the Aes is something we do find in the mythology. And then in the more recent folklore, recent being a relative term, of course, we do see the concept continuing. So when we look at this idea of glossing elves as incubi, it may have come about to some degree because the Christians were interpreting these beings as dangerous and therefore equating them to demons. But the idea of the sexuality and the sexual nature does seem to be something that was genuine to the original pagan traditions. So, and that is kind of something that's important to consider. I do have some notes because I want to make sure I'm not skipping over anything. This is important. We do see in the 14th century Chaucer in the Wife of Bath's Tale specifically mentioning the idea of elves and fairies. He's one of the first people in English that uses the term fairy, both as a place and as the beings that come from that place. But we do see Chaucer discussing elves fathering children on mortal women. He does not refer to them as incubi, at least not in the version of the Canterbury Tales that I read. I don't have the original Middle English, I believe it's written in. Old English? Middle English? Anyway, I don't have the older language version. I only have the modern English translation. But I do not believe he refers to them as incubi. He only refers to them as elves. So there's that. We also do see, however, and I mention that because there is that connection to elves having sexual congress, as it were, with human women and fathering children with them, again with the implication that they would only be male. And we do also see in the Scottish material, particularly the lowland Scottish material, both in ballads and in some of the references from Sir Walter Scott, which would be a little bit later, and some of the earlier material as well, where elves are directly equated to incubi. And that could indicate that that concept had become more widespread. These are, of course, things that are being written down by more educated people. The literati in general had a habit of being familiar with how the church was referring to things. Generally speaking, the literati were often church people, so it's not uncommon to see that sort of thing. But it does sort of say that at that point, the understanding that elves and incubi were sort of equivalents had become sort of a cultural concept, at least by Sir Walter Scott's time. So, and that would be 18th century, I believe. We do, as I had mentioned before, see this as well in the Irish. In the Irish, of course, it's not only male elves, if you will. We see the idea of fairy wives, We see that quite a bit, even going back to the Ektakadla, which is the oldest, as far as I'm aware, in the Celtic material, story of an otherworldly being, a fairy, if you will, who directly interacts and takes a mortal lover. In this case, it's a fairy woman who comes into our world and courts the son of Canla, and convinces him to go back with her into fairy. And he is never seen again, so we assume he goes and lives there happily with her, as far as we know. That dates back to the 9th century in writing. Scholars generally think it probably was a much older oral story that was only then written down in the 9th century. So that indicates that at least as far back as then, there was this idea that fairies could decide to have congress with mortals. I like the word congress. It has so many nice implications to it. Could decide they had an interest in mortals and take them for that purpose. And in that story, there's no discussion of incubi or incubuses or demons or any of that. She just shows up and wants him to go with her, and then eventually he does. Initially his family resists, so it's sort of the whole purpose of the story is telling that tale, but he does eventually go back with her. And of course we also have the much more widely known story of Niamh and Oisin, where Oisin, of course, is the son of the epic hero Finn, and Niamh is, in many versions, the daughter of Manannán. She comes from the otherworld and falls in love with Oisin, convinces him to go back with her to the land of Faerie. They live happily, they have 2 children together, a son and a daughter, and then he really misses the mortal world, he misses his family, wants to come back and at least see them. She, of course, tells him that's a very bad idea, not to do it. He insists. She finally relents and gives him a horse to ride back on, but warns him if he touches the ground, he will never be able to return to Faerie. Of course, the way these things always go, he does come back, finds out that whereas he had thought only a very short amount of time had passed, it had actually been hundreds of years. Ireland has now become Christianized. The men, from his point of view, have all become very weak. He goes to try to help some of them lift a stone. The saddle breaks, the girth of the saddle breaks. He falls. When he touches the ground, all his years come upon him and he ages immediately. Before he dies, he manages to tell his whole story and the story of Finn and the Fianna, I believe to St. Patrick, if I remember correctly. St. Patrick is everywhere in the stories, but either way, tells it to someone, and that, of course, is how we know all the stories today, so they say. But the point, of course, here is just that he is immortal, a mortal, not immortal, a mortal, who is taken by one of the other crowd into Faerie as her spouse, has children with her. Again, an Irish example of this. We also have many examples of different fairy beings who use sexuality and seduction more for dangerous means. We have the Gencanach, who, the love talker in English, who seduces mortal women into his bed, sucks the life out of them, and then they pine away, waste away, and die. We have the Lánanshi. The Lánanshi is a little complicated. Lánanshi just means fairy lover, and we do see examples of Lánanshi that are just a fairy lover, a fairy who is a lover to a mortal. And in some cases, this is not a dangerous thing. Although, as with anything related to fairy, there's always a cost, and there's always rules to be followed. So, generally speaking, even with the benevolent, I guess we'll say, Lananshi. The person cannot speak of them to any others, or the Lananshi will disappear forever in many of the accounts. And they kind of have to, it has to be sort of a secret, just in general. We'll leave it at that. And in many cases, the person does end up eventually going and joining their fairy lover in fairy, which means they often die young. There are other versions of the Lananshi which are more outright malicious. Yeats discussed them. I personally sort of suspect that the more malicious Lananshi could be sort of rooted in just stories warning people not to take fairy lovers. I don't know. But the more malicious ones generally are said to, much like the Genkanak, suck the life force out of people. They're generally, the malicious ones are viewed as female only, whereas I do want to say that the generally benevolent ones are not. They can be male or female. The malicious ones are generally always described as female. They are inspirational, they inspire poets and musicians, but they do shorten their life. There are also versions, not in Ireland, I believe in the Isle of Man, of the Lananshi that are actually vampiric, that do suck the blood, as it were. And there's a Scottish version, not a Lananshi per se, they're called Bavanshi, which is Scottish Gaelic. She, of course, means a fairy of fairy. Bavan means like a dangerous fairy woman. So Bavanshi is like a dangerous woman of fairy. And they are also literally vampiric. They drink the blood of their victim. But they do that by seducing the victim first, usually into dancing or otherwise getting into a, shall we say, intimate position with them. Not necessarily outright sexual, but sex is sort of a factor involved with them. So I'll include them in this discussion. Either way, we do see those sort of aspects. So we can establish that in the original culture, the idea of fairies being sexual and having sexual encounters with humans is pretty solid, and is something we see across the folklore. And even into modern terms, in anecdotes and in traditional material, this is something we see. This is where it gets complicated. And I know this is not going to be a short video, but I warned you it was a complicated subject. So then we have the Victorians. And the Victorians, of course, sort of re-envisioned fairies. And their re-envisioning is sort of how the dominant cultural view of fairies is today in a lot of ways. Not the only major influence, but it is one of the big ones. So what happened when the Victorians came in is they took the older traditional views and they sort of changed fairies into very childlike beings, very tiny beings. The whole winged children in gardens things, that's very Victorian. And initially, there is this sort of turning fairies into very, not androgynous per se, but desexualized. Unfortunately, the Victorians are disturbing in some ways, and that pendulum kind of swung the other way, and then we end up having these very sexualized, very childlike fairies, which is super creepy. Super, super creepy. So that's a thing. But the idea of making fairies very childlike definitely comes from the Victorians and definitely impacted how we today, particularly in more pop culture and more mainstream culture in America, tend to understand fairies and the concept of fairies, humans, and sex in paganism. then we have Tolkien. Now, mind you, I love Tolkien. I'm a huge Tolkien fan. Silmarillion is awesome. Hobbit's awesome. Lord of the Rings, totally awesome. However, when Tolkien wrote about his elves, he was coming from a very Catholic place. Very, very Catholic. And he sort of made his elves the idealized version of his own morality. There's a couple really good articles you can find online discussing this. So he made his elves very androgynous, first of all. He also made them very, I need to think how to properly say this. It's not that they're asexual, because they're not, but the elves in Tolkien's world, if they have sex, are then married to the person that they have sex with, which, as I understand it, is kind of a very Catholic approach to this. I don't know exactly, but that's what some of the articles argue. But effectively, Tolkien's elves are androgynous, which is something that we do see carried forward, and also tend to be very sexually chaste. Chaste is in CHASTE, not pursued. Although, I guess in fan fiction now they are. But they tend to be very celibate for the most part. They're very loyal to their one spouse. And once in their youth, they do have sex with a person. That is now their spouse forever and ever. When their spouse dies, they do not remarry. He just had a very, very strict and set approach to his elves and sexuality. And Tolkien's elves have been very foundational to how later writers and later culture sort of understood elves. And if you're not sure if that's true, just look at how modern elves are often described. Although in the past 5 years or so, we're seeing gaming and comic books have an effect on how elves are pictured. But up until the last 5 years or so, Tolkien's elves have kind of been the template for how we picture that particular type of being. And how he described them acting has also kind of been important. I can think of quite a lot of fiction, urban fantasy in particular, from the 80s and 90s that describes elves along Tolkien-esque lines. Androgynous, not particularly sexual, which isn't a judgment on asexuality, by the way. It's just that is very unusual compared to the older traditional folklore. So we have this sort of new stream coming in where elves are wise advisors and counselors to people, but they're not really super interested in getting it on with humans. That, I think, is a very Tolkien sort of approach. Tolkien also, it might be pointed out, did not really have a lot of humans and elves crossing over. Everyone does think of Arwen and Aragorn, and there is that example. There is one other really popular example if you read a lot of Tolkien. And then there was another example of an elf who fell in love with a human and they never actually did anything about it. Precisely because they would have been married if they had ever hooked up. So, other than that, though, Tolkien was not a big one for the idea of elves and humans getting together. And I think we do see that influencing pop culture to a degree. I realize modern pop culture, modern urban fantasy, does kind of emphasize the whole romance between elves and humans, but it's romance, and it's usually a star-crossed kind of thing. Like, it's discouraged, but the main character does it anyway. And that still falls into this idea that this is something that shouldn't be done or doesn't happen, and it's an exception in this particular story. That's important, because that really goes against the older folklore and tradition. Okay, so we are getting close to the end. I know this is a longer video. Now, adding into all of that, we have the more modern, sort of influenced by theosophy and spiritualism and the New Age concept that fairies are not physical beings. And again, in older traditional belief and older traditional lore, they can be. There's a lot of question about how physical they always are, but they certainly had and have the ability to physically interact with our world and with us. However, in the more modern view, in the last 150 years, we sort of see this idea that fairies actually are not physical beings at all, that they do not really exist in our reality. You start to see this shift into them being described as only like little balls of light, as tiny, almost insect-like beings. And this, again, is very different and at odds from traditional older folklore. It's a very new way to understand them. It's sort of drawing on the Victorian view, but with a twist. So what we end up having is this sort of modern understanding, which I run into all the time, that fairies are not tangible beings, that they have no physicality to them, potentially don't have physicality to them even in their own world, not just in our world, but they literally have no physicality at all anywhere in any realm. That they're light beings, that they kind of get sometimes crossed over into angels, who are also viewed as asexual and androgynous, and that fairies are kind of these spirit guide beings. Again, I think a little bit of that can come in a tiny bit with some Tolkien influence, and again with the angel crossover. So it's just modern view and understanding of them just as being these would never have any interest in getting it on with humans, as it were. Well, the problem with that is that's just really not how folklore and traditional material paints them, if you will, describes them. And I think even if we look at modern anecdotes, if we look at modern people across different cultures talking about interactions they have with them, it is clear that these encounters, these more sexual encounters, do still happen. I think people are a lot more reluctant to talk about them, specifically because the primary narrative now has become their little tiny glowing balls of light who want you to be the best person you can be. So it's sort of hard to counter that by saying, well, I had an encounter with one that was trying really hard, to have an encounter with me, if you know what I'm saying. Trying to keep this video very PG-13. So I think that we, as modern practitioners, whatever you're practicing, as people who are trying to reconnect to a more genuine, older understanding of these beings, have to be honest about the nature of them. Certainly there are going to be some types of fairies, some types of these beings who have genuinely no interest in us at all, or who genuinely have no interest in us in a sexual way. But there certainly are those that do, and that always have. Some of them are dangerous. And just because I'm saying here, yes, there is a historic and folkloric tradition of humans and fairies having sex and producing children, physical, real, exist in our reality, physically born children, by the way. That does not mean that I'm saying this is a good idea to rush out and try to do. Some of these beings are dangerous, and some of them will use this as a weapon, quite frankly. However, there are also those who, might have different motivations or different reasons for doing it. I would suggest, if this is a topic that really interests you, to look into some of the older folklore and older history relating to the topic. There is quite a lot of it. You do have to dig around a bit, but you can find it. It is there. Kelpies are one of the more dangerous ones that have been known to take human lovers and produce children. If you want examples of how that can go really wrong, look into some of the Kelpie lore. There's stories of Benfiesa, wise women in Ireland, who had Lonanshi of the more benevolent type. You can look into that. You can look into some of the stories I've referenced in this video. And this has now gone half an hour. So I think I'll wrap this up here. Hopefully I very thoroughly covered sort of the evolution of how our modern American culture, at least, has viewed fairies and sex and humans. If you have any questions, feel free to drop me a line on the video and I will try to respond. I think this is pretty in-depth on the topic. And hopefully I've answered all the questions. But I do encourage people in a modern setting, particularly if you're looking at working or dealing with these beings, to keep all of this in mind, and to keep in mind that the modern understanding of them as androgynous and asexual and not interested in humans in a sexual way is not necessarily accurate, or I should say is not accurate at all. To some of them, and that if you want to work with them and deal with them, you do need to be aware that that is a factor that can come into play, and just be prepared for it. Not something you really want to get caught off guard with. So just sort of my closing thought there. And I hope everyone has a great day. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye, everybody.